Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. Man, is this mic on? It's on like a 7. I'm going to turn it down so like it's a little loud. All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. Yeah, I think that last episode might end up being a little too loud. Sorry about that. We are reading Chapter 6 of The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. This chapter is entitled Of the Training of Black Men. Why, if the soul can fling the dusk aside and naked on the air of heaven ride, we're not ashamed, weren't not ashamed for him in this clay carcass crippled to abide. Omar Khayyam. From the shimmering swirl of waters where many, many thoughts ago the slave ship first saw the square tower of Jamestown, have flowed down to our day 3 streams of thinking. One swollen from the larger world here and overseas, saying, the multiplying of human wants in cultured lands calls for the worldwide cooperation of men in satisfying them. Hence arises a new human unity, pulling the ends of earth nearer and all men, black, yellow, and white. The larger humanity strives to fill in this contact of living nations and sleeping hordes a thrill of new life in the world, crying, quote, if the contact of life and sleep be death, shame on such life, end quote. To be sure, behind this thought lurks the afterthought of force and dominion, the making of brown men to delve in the temptation of beads and red calico cloyds. The second thought, streaming from the death ship and the courting, the second thought, streaming from the death ship and the curving river, is the thought of the older South. The sincere and passionate belief that somewhere between men and cattle, God created a terriatum quid and called it a Negro, a clownish, simple creature, at times even lovable within its limitations, but straightly foreordained to walk within the veil. To be sure, behind the thought lurks the afterthought. Some of them, with favoring chance, might become men, but in sheer self-defense we dare not let them, and we build about them walls so high and hang between them and the light a veil so thick that they shall not even think of breaking through. And last of all, there trickles down that third and darker thought, the thought of the things themselves, the confused, half-conscious mutter of men who are black and white and whitened, crying, quote, liberty, freedom, opportunity, vouchsafe to us, O boastful world, the chance of living men, end quote. To be sure, behind the thought lurks the afterthought. Suppose, after all, the world is right, and we are less than men. Suppose this mad impulse within is all wrong, some mock mirage from the untrue. So here we stand among thoughts of human unity, even through conquest and slavery, the inferiority of black men, even enforced by fraud, a shriek in the night for the freedom of men who themselves are not yet sure of their right to demand it. This is the tangle of thought and afterthought wherein we are called to solve the problem of training men for life. Behind all this curiousness, so attractive alike to sage and Dialante, lie its dim dangers, throwing across us shadows at once grotesque and awful. Plain it is to us that the world seeks through desert and wild, we have within our threshold a stalwart laboring force. Oh man, okay, let me try that again. Plain it is to us that the world seeks through desert. I ain't going. Okay, hold on. Let me say this. So there are certain people who different writers and different content in which they write. There's like maybe like a 0.001 second from when I'm speaking it and me understanding it, and with different authors or again different content, that time span might become longer and longer, and so that usually helps with my cadence. And usually after like the first 20-30 pages or so, I begin to find the rhythm of the author. However, and maybe it's because there's different essays within here, but however, it takes me a second to figure out where he's going with these sentences sometimes, and that is what leads to me fumbling and bumbling over my words. So excuse me. Let me try that sentence again. Now I have lost the sentence. I have lost where we're at now. Okay. No. Okay. Okay. All right. Let's go. Plain it is to us that what the world seeks through desert and wild, we have within our threshold. A stalwart laboring force, suited to the semi-tropes, suited to the semi-tropics. If, deaf to the voice of the zeitgeist, we refuse to use and develop these men, we risk poverty and loss. If, on the other hand, seized by the brutal afterthought, we debauch the race thus caught in our talons, selfishly sucking their blood and brains in the future as in the past, what shall save us from national decadence? Only that sin or selfishness, which education teaches men, can find the rights of all in the world of work. Again, we may decry the color prejudice of the South, yet it remains a heavy fact. Such curious kinks of the human mind exist and must be reckoned with soberly. They cannot be laughed away, nor always successfully stormed at, nor easily abolished by active legislature. And yet they must not be encouraged by being let alone. They must be recognized as facts, but unpleasant facts. Things that stand in the way of civilization and religion and common decency. They can be met in but one way, by the breadth and the broadening of human reason, by Catholicity of taste and culture. And so, too, the native ambition and aspiration of men, even though they be black, backward, and ungraceful, must not lightly be dealt with. To stimulate wildly weak and untrained minds is to play with mighty fires. To flout their striving idly is to welcome a harvest of brutish crime and shameless lethargy in our very laps. The guiding of thought and the deft coordination of deed is at once the path of honor and humanity. And so, in this great question of reconciling three vast and partially contradictory streams of thought, the one panacea of education leaps to the lips of all. Such human training as will best use the labor of all men without enslaving or brutalizing. Such training as will give us poise to encourage the prejudices that bulwark society, and to stamp out those that in sheer barbarity deafen us to the wail of prison souls within the veil, and the mounting fury of shackled men. I'm gonna read this next paragraph and then we'll do a reflection. But when we have vaguely said that education will set this tangle straight, what have we uttered but a truism? Training for life teaches living, but what training for the profitable living together of black men and white? 150 years ago, our task would have seemed easier. Then, Dr. Johnson blandly assured us that education was needful solely for the embellishments of life and was useless for ordinary vermin. Today, we have climbed to heights where we would open at least the outer courts of knowledge to all, display its treasures to many, and select the few to whom its mystery of truth is revealed, not wholly by birth or the accidents of the stock market, but at least in part according to deftness and aim, talent and character. This program, however, we are sorely puzzled in carrying out through that part of the land where the blight of slavery fell hardest, and where we are dealing with two backward peoples. To make here in human education that ever necessary combination of the permanent and the contingent, of the ideal and practical and workable equilibrium, has been there, as it ever must be in every age and place, a matter of infinite experiment and frequent mistakes. Okay. As W.E.B. Du Bois opens this chapter, he's speaking about the importance of training, the importance of education, which are two different things, training and education. But he's speaking about the importance of black men having those things because of how deprived they have been of both things for so long. Black men were not seen, slaves were not, black men, black women, black children, black people, black individuals, black people were not seen as workers when they were slaves. They were seen as property. They were seen as tools, as instruments. And they not after generations of not only just not being allowed to read or write, but being a capital punishment. You being able to receive capital punishment for being able to read or write. It it imprinted a generational trauma of the concepts of education and training. And then even then there were substandard schools. And then even now till to this day, there is a very unique relationship that black people have in this country with the concepts of education and training. And so just the importance of both of those things is what stands out to me in that passage we just read. And I hope that these Rockford readings provide a little bit of both of those things in a way for people. All right. In rough approximation, we may point out four varying decades of work in Southern education since the Civil War. From the close of the war until 1876 was the period of uncertain groping and temporary relief. There were army schools, mission schools, and schools of the Freedmen's Bureau in chaotic disarrangement seeking system and cooperation. Then followed 10 years of constructive, definite effort toward the building of complete school systems in the South. Normal schools and colleges were founded for the freedmen, and teachers trained there to man the public schools. There was the inevitable tendency of war to underestimate the prejudices of the master and the ignorance of the slave, and all seemed clear sailing out of the wreckage of the storm. Meantime, starting in this decade, yet especially developing from 1885 to 1895, began the Industrial Revolution of the South. The land saw glimpses of a new destiny and the stirring of new ideals. The educational system striving to complete itself saw new obstacles in a field of work ever broader and deeper. The Negro colleges, hurriedly founded, were inadequately equipped, illogically distributed, and of varying efficiency and grade. The normal and high schools were doing little more than common school work, and the common schools were training but a third of the children who ought to be in them, and training these too often poorly. At the same time, the white South, by reason of its sudden conversion from the slavery ideal, by so much the more became set and strengthened in its racial prejudice and crystallized it into harsh law and harsher customs. While the marvelous pushing forward of the poor white daily threatened to take even bread and butter from the mouths of the heavily handicapped sons of the freedmen. In the midst, then, of the larger problem of Negro education sprang up the more practical question of work, the inevitable economic quandary that faces a people in the transition from slavery to freedom, and especially those who make that change amid hate and prejudice, lawlessness, and ruthless competition. The industrial schools springing to notice in this decade, but coming to full recognition in the decade beginning with 1895, was the proffered answer to this combined educational and economic crisis, and an answer of singular wisdom and timeliness. From the very first, in nearly all the schools, some attention had been given to training in handiwork, but now was this training first raised to a dignity that brought it in direct touch with South's magnificent industrial development and given an emphasis which reminded black folk that before the temple of knowledge swing the gates of toil. Yet after all they are but gates, and when turning our eyes from the temporary and the contingent in the Negro problem to the broader question of the permanent uplifting and civilization of black men in America, we have a right to inquire, as this enthusiasm for material advancement mounts to its height, if after all the industrial school is the final and sufficient answer in the training of the Negro race. And to ask gently, but in all sincerity, the ever reoccurring query of the ages, is not life more than meat, and the body more than raiment? And men ask this today all the more eagerly because of sinister signs in recent educational movements. The tendency is here, born of slavery and quickened to renewed life by the crazy imperialism of the day, to regard human beings as among the material resources of a land to be trained with an eye single to future dividends. Race prejudices, which keep brown and black men in their, quote, places, end quote, we are coming to regard as useful allies with such a theory, no matter how much they may dull the ambition and sicken the hearts of struggling human beings. And above all, we daily hear that an education that encourages aspiration, that sets the loftiest of ideals and seeks as an end culture and character rather than breadwinning, is the privilege of white men and the danger and delusion of black. Especially has criticism been directed against the former educational efforts to aid the Negro. In the four periods I have mentioned, we find first, boundless, planless enthusiasm and sacrifice. Then the preparation of teachers for a vast public school system. Then the launching and expansion of that school system amid increasing difficulties. And finally, the training of workmen for the new and growing industries. This development has been sharply ridiculed as a logical anomaly and flat reversal of nature. Soothly, we have been told that first industrial and manual training should have taught the Negro to work, then simple schools should have taught him to read and write, and finally, after years, high and normal schools could have completed the system as intelligence and wealth demanded. That a system logically so complete was historically impossible, it needs but a little thought to prove. Progress in human affairs is more often a pull than a push, surging forward of the exceptional man and the lifting of his duller brethren slowly and painfully to his vantage ground. Thus, it was no accident that gave birth to universities centuries before the common schools, that made fair Harvard the first flower of our wilderness. So in the South, the mass of the freedmen at the end of the way lacked the intelligence so necessary to modern working men. They must first have the common school to teach them to read, write, and cipher, and they must have higher schools to teach teachers for common schools. The white teachers who flocked south went to establish such a common school system. Few held the idea of founding colleges. Most of them at first would have laughed at the idea. But they faced, as all men since them have faced, the essential paradox of the South, the social separation of the races. At that time, it was the sudden volcanic rupture of nearly all relations between black and white in work and government and family life. Since then, a new adjustment of relations in economic and political affairs has grown up, an adjustment subtle and difficult to grasp, yet singularly ingenious, which leaves still that frightful chasm at the color line across which men pass at their peril. Thus, then and now, there stand in the South two separate worlds, and separate not simply in the higher realms of social intercourse, but also in church and school, on railway and streetcar, in hotels and theaters, in streets and city sections, in books and newspapers, in asylums and jails, in hospitals and graveyards. There is still enough contact for large economic and group cooperation, but the separation is so thorough and deep that it absolutely precludes, for the present, between the races, anything like that sympathetic and effective group training and leadership of the one by the other, such as the American Negro and all backwards peoples must have for effectual progress. Okay, and let's take a moment to reflect there. I think we'll finish this chapter. We might have to split this chapter up. I'm not sure. What stands out to me there is how W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the way in which he believed black people needed to be becoming educated, the way black people needed to be being taught, and the reason for it needing to be done in a unique way, in a specific way to them. And I think that that's something that remains true now. It may be a different manner, but it's something that is still true now, that a black child needs to be taught in a way that is different from a white child. He needs to understand things in a way that a white child doesn't need to understand from the same vantage point, because of the different experiences that they will have through life. And part of schooling and education and teaching is preparing somebody for the unique path that they will face as they go down life. Okay, let's continue reading. This the missionaries of 68 soon saw, and if effective, industrial and trade schools were impracticable before the establishment of a common school system. Just as certainly, no adequate common schools could be founded until there were teachers to teach them. Southern whites would not teach them. Northern whites in sufficient numbers could not be had. If the Negro was to learn, he must teach himself, and the most effective help that could be given him was the establishment of schools to train Negro teachers. This conclusion was slowly but surely reached by every student of the situation until simultaneously, in widely separated regions, without consultation or systematic plan, there arose a series of institutions designed to furnish teachers for the untaught. Above the sneers of critics at the obvious defects of this procedure must ever stand its one crushing rejoinder. In a single generation, they put 30,000 black teachers in the South. They wiped out the literacy of the majority of the black people of the land, and they made Tuskegee possible. Such higher training schools tended naturally to deepen broader development. At first, they were common in grammar schools, then some became high schools, and finally, by 1900, some 34 had 1 year or more of studies of college grad. This development was reached with different degrees of speed in different institutions. Hampton is still a high school, while Fisk University started her college in 1871 and Spelman Seminary about 1896. In all cases, the aim was identical: to maintain the standards of the lower training by giving teachers and leaders the best practicable training, and above all, to furnish the black world with adequate standards of human culture and lofty ideals of life. It was not enough that the teachers of teachers should be trained in technical norm methods. They must also, so far as possible, be broad-minded, cultured men and women to scatter civilization among a people whose ignorance was not simply of letters, but of life itself. It can thus be seen that the work of education in the South began with higher institutions of training, which threw off as their foliage common schools and later industrial schools, and at the same time strove to shoot their roots even deeper toward college and university training. That this was an inevitable and necessary development sooner or later goes without saying, but there has been, and still is, a question in many minds if the natural growth was not forced and if the higher training was not either overdone or done with cheap and unsound methods. Among white Southerners, this feeling is widespread and positive. A prominent Southern journal voiced this in a recent editorial. Quote, "The experiment that has been made to give the colored students classical training has not been satisfactory. Even though many were able to pursue the course, most of them did so in a parrot-like way, learning what was taught, but not seeming to appropriate the truth and import of their instruction, and graduating without sensible aim or valuable occupation for their future. The whole scheme has proved a waste of time, efforts, and the money of the state." End quote. While most fair-minded men would recognize this as extreme and overdrawn, still without doubt many are asking, are there a sufficient number of Negroes ready for college training to warrant the undertaking? Are not too many students prematurely forced into this work? Does it not have the effect of dissatisfying the young Negro with his environment? And do these graduates succeed in real life? Such natural questions cannot be evaded, nor on the other hand must the nation naturally skeptical as to Negro ability assume an unfavorable answer without careful inquiry and patient openness to conviction. We must not forget that most Americans answer all queries regarding the Negro a priori, and that the last that human courtesy can do is to listen to evidence. The least that human courtesy can do is listen to evidence. The advocates of the higher education of the Negro will be the last to deny the incompleteness and glaring defects of the present system. Too many institutions have attempted to do college work. The work in some cases has not been thoroughly done, and quantity, rather than quality, has sometimes been sought. But all this can be said of higher education throughout the land. It is the almost inevitable incident of educational growth and leaves the deeper question of the legitimate demand for the higher training of Negroes untouched. And this latter question can be settled in but one way: by a first-hand study of the facts. If we leave out of view all institutions which have not actually graduated students from a course higher than that of a New England high school, even though they be called colleges, if then we take the 34 remaining institutions, we may clear up any misapprehensions by asking searchingly, what kind of institutions are they? What do they teach? And what sort of men do they graduate? And first, we may say that this type of college, including Atlanta, Fisk, and Howard, Wilberforce, and Lincoln, Biddle, Shaw, and the rest, is peculiar, almost unique. Through the shining trees that whisper before me as I write, I catch glimpses of a boulder of New England granite, covering a grave, which graduates of Atlanta University have placed there with this inscription. Quote, "In grateful memory of their former teacher and friend, and of the unselfish life he lived, and the noble work he wrought, that they, their children, and their children's children might be blessed. End quote. This was the gift of New England to the freed Negro. Not alms, but a friend. Not cash, but character. It was not and is not money these seething millions want, but love and sympathy, the pulse of hearts beating with red bloods, a gift which today only their own kindred and race can bring to the masses, but which once saintly souls brought to their favorite children in the crusade of the 60s, that finest thing in American history, and one of the few things untainted by sordid greed and cheap vainglory. The teachers in these institutions came not to keep the Negroes in their place, but to raise them out of the defilement of the places where slavery had wallowed them. The colleges they founded were social settlements, homes where the best of the sons of the freedmen came in close and sympathetic touch with the best traditions of New England. They lived and ate together, studied and worked, hoped and hearkened in the dawning light. In actual formal content, their curriculum was doubtless old-fashioned, but in educational power it was supreme, for it was the contact of living souls. From such schools, about 2,000 Negroes have gone forth with the bachelor's degree. The number in itself is enough to put at rest the argument that too large a proportion of Negroes are receiving higher training. If the ratio to population of all Negro students throughout the land, in both college and secondary training, be counted, Commissioner Harris assures us, quote, it must be increased to 5 times its present average, end quote, to equal the average of the land. From such 50 years ago, the ability of Negro students in any appreciable numbers to master a modern college course would have been difficult to prove. Today, it is proved by the fact that 400 Negroes, many of whom have been reported as brilliant students, have received a bachelor's degree from Harvard, Yale, Oberlin, and 70 other leading colleges. Here we have, then, nearly 2,500 Negro graduates, of whom the crucial query must be made. How far did their training fit them for life? It is of course extremely difficult to collect satisfactory data on such a point. Difficult to reach the men, to get trustworthy testimony, and to gauge that testimony by any generally acceptable criterion of success. In 1900, the conference at Atlanta University undertook to study these graduates and publish the results. First, they sought to know what these graduates were doing and succeeded in getting answers from nearly 2/3 of the living. The direct testimony was in almost all cases corroborated by the reports of the colleges where they graduated, so that in the main the reports were worthy of credence. 53% of these graduates were teachers, presidents of institutions, heads of normal schools, principals of city school systems, and the like. 17% were clergymen. Another 17% were in the professions, chiefly as physicians. Over 6% were merchants, farmers, and artisans, and 4% were in the government civil service. Granting even that a considerable proportion of the third, unheard from, are unsuccessful, this is a record of usefulness. Personally, I know many hundreds of these graduates and have corresponded with more than 1,000. Through others, I have followed carefully the life work of scores. I have taught some of them, and some of the pupils whom they have taught lived in homes which they have builded and looked at life through their eyes. Comparing them as a class with my fellow students in New England and in Europe, I cannot hesitate in saying that nowhere have I met men and women with a broader spirit of helpfulness, with deeper devotion to their life work, or with more consecrated determination to succeed in the face of bitter difficulties than among Negro, college-bred men. They have, to be sure, their proportion of ne'er-do-wells, their pedants and lettered fools, but they have surprisingly small proportion of them. They have not that culture of manner which we instinctively associate with university men, forgetting that in reality it is the heritage from cultured homes, and that no people a generation removed from slavery can escape a certain unpleasant rawness and gaucherie, despite the best of training. Okay, so we're at about 30 minutes, and we're going to go ahead and end this episode here. and we will have to finish this chapter on the next episode. I know we have been doing a chapter episode, but we have been going over our 30-minute mark, well over for the past 4 or 5 episodes. So we're going to end this here. I want to encourage people to share this on whatever platform they may be listening to it on. I do want to have a give a small assessment of the last pages that we read there. The I'm getting a better understanding of what Du Bois, and I have been corrected. It is Du Bois, not Dubois. I'm getting a better understanding of what Du Bois means by the training of Black people and the training of the Negro that he spoke of, and the importance of the training and his belief that it needed to be men needed not only to be educated but to be trained to be able to lead. And I think that understanding that really is I think understanding this generation, the generation that the boys was part of, is very key to understanding every other generation that came after him in the Black community, and where some of their thought patterns and beliefs and cultures and norms and traditions originate from. And I think that one of the main things that I have taken away from what we've read here is just how drastic. Drastic is just the gravity of the situation that existed for Black people at the end of slavery. Once slavery at the end of emancipation, or the beginning of the emancipation. A lot of times it's spoken about as this celebratory thing, and it's spoken about as this view of success, or this view of progression. And in reading this, you really start to get the understanding of just how desperate each day was for these people, whether it be from the fear of white supremacy raining down in a violent manner, or just the discrimination and exploitation that they experienced in just trying to get a day's work, or just trying to have a roof over their head. And even just, something as simple as becoming educated and being able to learn, so that way they weren't being further perpetuated through this cycle. Uh, and so those are just some of the things that I really am getting away from reading this. I've also been listening to some of Du Bois's speeches in the midst of me reading this. And so just the gravity of the time period he lived in, this first generation from slavery, and all the things that came with it. So please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on, and I'll holler at you tomorrow. Be back for another episode of Rockford Reading Daily.